I used to think the house only sounded alive at night because it was old. The floorboards sighed when the air cooled. The walls clicked softly like knuckles cracking in their sleep. Even the curtains seemed to breathe when the wind slipped through the cracks of the windows. But after a while, I realized the house wasn't waking up at night. Grandma was. She slept most of the day in her armchair by the window, her thin hands folded neatly over a blanket she'd had longer than I'd been alive. The television stayed on low volume, though I don't think she followed the shows anymore. Her eyes closed often, but her mind never seemed far away. At night, though, everything changed. Her eyes sharpened, her voice lowered, and sometimes, when she thought no one else was awake, she whispered. The first time I heard it, I was 12. I couldn't sleep and went to the kitchen for water. That's when I heard her voice coming from the living room, soft and broken, like it was leaking out of her instead of being spoken. I froze halfway down the hallway, the cold tile biting into my feet. "I never meant for you to know," she whispered. "God knows I tried to bury it." I thought she was praying, that's what I told myself, but there was no rhythm to it, no comfort, just fragments, names I didn't recognize, a date she repeated twice, each time quieter than the last. I stood there, holding my breath, afraid that even listening might be a kind of sin. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She smiled at me over breakfast, asked if I'd slept well, reminded me to bring a sweater. I watched her hands carefully as she buttered her toast. They were steady, calm, like the night had never touched her. After that, the whispers came more often, always after midnight, always when the house was still enough to feel like it might crack. I tried not to listen, but it was hard not to when my room was right across from hers. Sometimes I heard my name. Sometimes I heard words like, "Forgive me," or "I had no choice." Once I heard her say, very clearly, "This was never meant to be told." That was the night I realized she wasn't talking to herself. She was talking to someone who wasn't there. Or maybe she was talking to someone who was. I started staying up, pretending to read. My door cracked just enough to let her voice slip through. My heart would pound every time she spoke, half terrified she'd catch me listening, half desperate to understand what story she was carrying alone. Whatever it was, it weighed on her. I could hear it in the pauses, the way her breath hitched before certain words, the way she always stopped short, as if remembering something too sharp to touch. I didn't know then that once she finally let me hear the whole story, nothing in our family would ever feel the same again. I told myself I was imagining patterns where there were none. Adults whispered all the time, didn't they? Old people talked in their sleep. Houses creaked. Memories leaked out when people thought no one was listening. That was the lie I repeated to myself every night as I lay awake, staring at the faint glow under Grandma's door. But the whispers weren't random. They followed a rhythm. 3 slow breaths, a pause, then her voice, lowered so much it sounded like it was coming from somewhere deeper than her throat. One night I heard her say a name I'd never heard before. She said it carefully, like it might shatter if she spoke too loud. "Eleanor," she whispered. The name hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar. No one in our family was named Eleanor. I knew that for sure. Grandma had told me our family tree so many times I could recite it like a poem. Yet she said the name again, softer this time, and followed it with words that made my skin prickle. "They told me to forget you." I sat up in bed, my blanket sliding to the floor. The hallway felt colder than usual, as if the house itself was leaning in to listen. I crept closer to my door, my heart hammering so loud I was sure she'd hear it, but she didn't stop. "I tried," she whispered. "I did what they said. I lived my life, I raised children, I smiled for pictures. But you don't forget something like that." Something shifted in me then. This wasn't sleep talk. This wasn't prayer. This was a confession. The next day, I asked her about the name. I tried to sound casual, like it had just drifted into my head. Grandma, I said, while helping her fold laundry, did you ever know someone named Eleanor? Her hands froze around a towel, just for a second. Then she folded it neatly and placed it on the pile without looking at me. Where did you hear that name? She asked. My stomach tightened. I don't know, I lied. I think I read it somewhere. She nodded slowly, but her eyes stayed on the window, not on me. Some names, she said, belong to quiet chapters, best left closed. After that, she became more careful. The whispers grew softer, shorter. Sometimes they stopped abruptly, like she'd realized she'd gone too far. Other nights, she didn't whisper at all. Those nights were the worst. Silence felt heavier than sound. Then came the locked door. I noticed it one evening when I went to say goodnight. Her bedroom door was shut tight, the knob turned fully to the right. That had never happened before. Grandma never locked her door, not in all the years we'd lived together. I knocked gently. Grandma? There was a long pause. Then her voice, strained but calm. Go to bed, she said. If you hear anything tonight, you didn't. I stood there long after she stopped speaking, my hand hovering near the door, my mind racing. Whatever story she was whispering, it wasn't just painful, it was dangerous. Dangerous enough to lock it away, dangerous enough to warn me off. But warnings have a way of sharpening curiosity instead of dulling it. And as I went back to my room, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Grandma's whispers weren't fading. They were getting closer to the truth. The night after Grandma locked her door, sleep refused to come. I lay on my side, facing the wall, counting the cracks in the paint just to keep my thoughts from spiraling. The house felt different now, like it was holding its breath. Even the old clock in the living room seemed quieter, its ticking muted, cautious. Then, just past midnight, the whispering started again. It wasn't coming from behind her door this time. It was closer, too close. I slowly turned onto my back, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might shake the bed. The sound drifted through the thin wall between our rooms, clearer than ever before. Grandma's voice trembled, not with fear, but with urgency, as if she knew time was running out. They said it was for the best, she whispered. They always say that, don't they? I pressed my ear to the wall, every sense sharpened. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken. She was just a child, so small, so quiet, you would have loved her. My breath caught. Loved her. Past tense. My mind raced, filling with images I didn't understand. Who was she talking about? Eleanor? A sister? A daughter? Someone who had existed and then hadn't? Grandma's voice cracked. They took you away, and they told me if I spoke your name again, I'd lose everything. The words hit me like a cold wave. Took you away. Lose everything. This wasn't a memory of an argument or a misunderstanding. This was something buried, something stolen. I heard the soft creak of her bed, the sound of fabric shifting as if she'd sat up. Her whisper dropped even lower. My hands were shaking now. I wrapped my arms around myself, torn between fear and an aching need to know more. Every instinct told me I was listening to something I wasn't meant to hear, but I couldn't pull away. They said you were gone, she murmured, but I see you every night, standing by the door. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced toward my own door, half expecting to see a shadow there. The hallway was dark, empty, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I wanted to call out to her, to tell her I was listening, that she didn't have to whisper anymore. But something in her tone stopped me. This wasn't meant for me. This was meant for the silence itself. The whispering slowed, her words stretching out between long, uneven breaths. "If I tell them now," she said, "it will destroy what's left. But if I don't, you'll keep knocking." Then, suddenly, it stopped. No soft sigh, no closing words, just silence, sharp and final. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours, my ears ringing from the absence of sound. When I finally dared to move, the house felt wrong, like a stage after the actors have left but the lights are still on. That night, I understood something I hadn't before. Grandma wasn't just remembering the past, she was being reminded, and whatever she had been forced to forget was no longer willing to stay quiet. The next morning, Grandma acted as if nothing had happened. She moved through the kitchen slowly, humming a tune I didn't recognize, her hands steady as she poured tea into her chipped porcelain cup. The door to her room stood open again, wide and ordinary, as though it had never been locked at all. For a moment, I wondered if the night before had been a dream stitched together by my own imagination. But then I saw her eyes. They were tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. When she noticed me watching, she smiled, but it didn't reach them. There was something guarded there now, something braced. "You're up early," she said softly. "I couldn't sleep," I replied, choosing my words carefully. The house felt loud. Her hand paused on the teacup, just for a second. Then she nodded. "Old houses make noises. They remember things." That was all she said, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. The rest of the day passed in uneasy quiet. Grandma kept busy, dusting shelves that were already clean, folding linens that didn't need folding. Every so often, I caught her staring at the hallway, her lips moving as if she were rehearsing words she didn't dare speak aloud. I wanted to ask her about the whispers, about the child, about the knocking she mentioned, but fear wrapped around my tongue. What if asking made it real in a way we couldn't undo? Night fell again, heavier than the last. I stayed awake on purpose this time, sitting up in bed with my lamp off, listening. Midnight came and went. 1 o'clock, 2. The house remained still, almost smug in its silence. Relief began to settle in, thin but welcome. Then I heard it. Not a whisper, a knock. It came from the front door, slow and deliberate. 3 soft taps, evenly spaced, like someone who knew they would be let in eventually. Grandma's bedroom door creaked open across the hall. I held my breath as her footsteps shuffled toward the door, each step careful, resigned. The air felt cold now, pressing against my skin. I slipped out of bed and cracked my door open just enough to see her standing in the dim hallway, wrapped in her old gray shawl. "Please," she whispered, not to me, but to the door. "Not tonight." The knocking came again, louder this time. Grandma straightened her back. I saw something settle into her face then, resolve mixed with grief. She placed her hand on the doorframe, steadying herself. "I kept your secret," she said, voice shaking but clear. "I paid the price you asked me to pay." Silence answered her. Then a voice I had never heard before spoke, soft but unmistakably close, seeping through the cracks of the house itself. "And now," it said, "it's time you told the truth." Grandma closed her eyes. I stepped back into my room, heart racing, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever story she had been whispering was about to be told out loud, and once it was, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat on the edge of my bed until the sky began to pale, replaying every word, every sound. When morning finally came, it didn't bring comfort. It brought a quiet dread, the kind that settles deep in your chest and refuses to move. Grandma didn't come out for breakfast.
By mid-morning, worry pushed me down the hallway toward her room. The door was open, sunlight spilling across the worn rug. She sat on the edge of her bed, hands folded in her lap, staring at the window as if she were waiting for something to arrive. "Grandma?" I said gently. She turned, startled, then sighed. "I was hoping you'd heard none of it," she murmured. My throat tightened. I heard everything. She patted the bed beside her. After a moment's hesitation, I sat. Up close, I could see how much older she looked, like the night had taken something from her she could never get back. "There was a time," she began, voice barely above a breath, "when families were told what to hide and what to erase, when keeping secrets was called love." She told me about a little girl born before I ever existed, about doctors who spoke in hushed tones and relatives who made decisions in back rooms, about fear dressed up as responsibility. The child was different, they said. A burden, they said. Easier if she disappeared from the story altogether. "They told me she'd be better off somewhere else," Grandma whispered. "They promised I'd forget." Her hands trembled. I reached for them, feeling how cold they were. "But you never did," I said.
She shook her head. "No, and when she came back, when she started knocking, I knew forgetting had never been an option. I understood then. The whispers weren't madness. They were memory demanding its place." That night, Grandma didn't lock her door. Instead, she lit a candle and sat in the living room, waiting. I stayed close, every nerve alert. When midnight arrived, the house shifted, the air thickening like before a storm. The knocking came again. 3 taps, steady, expectant. Grandma stood, shoulders squared. "I'm ready," she said. She spoke the truth out loud. Names, dates, choices made out of fear instead of love. With each word, the weight in the room seemed to lift. The knocking softened, then faded. When silence returned, it felt different, peaceful, final. Grandma sank into her chair, exhausted but lighter. "Some stories," she said, "won't stay buried. They whisper until someone listens." I sat beside her, understanding now why she only spoke at night, in hushed tones meant for those brave enough to hear. Some truths are powerful not because they're loud, but because they survive being whispered. The days after that night felt strangely ordinary, which somehow made everything heavier. Grandma moved slower, but her movements carried purpose now, like each step was chosen instead of endured. She opened curtains that had stayed closed for years. She cooked meals she hadn't made since I was small. The house breathed differently, as if it had finally exhaled after holding too much inside. But the silence didn't last. On the 4th night, I woke to the sound of the floorboards creaking, not outside Grandma's room, not near the front door, but right beside my bed. My eyes snapped open. The room was dark, yet I felt a presence so close my skin prickled. "Grandma?" I whispered. No answer. Then I heard her voice, not from the hallway, but inside the room itself. Soft, familiar, wrong. "You weren't supposed to hear it this way," she murmured. I sat up, heart hammering. She stood near the window, moonlight outlining her figure, but something about her was off. Her shadow didn't match her movements. It lagged, stretched, like it belonged to someone else. "You told the truth," I said, forcing the words out. "It's over." She smiled sadly. "Some truths don't end things. They open doors." The temperature dropped. I pulled the blanket tighter around myself. "Where is she now? The girl, the one they took?" Grandma's gaze drifted past me, toward the wall, closer than they ever wanted her to be. The knock came again, this time from inside the house. One soft tap, then another. It echoed through the walls, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Grandma's image flickered, like a reflection disturbed by water.
I kept her alive by remembering, she whispered, but silence kept her trapped. The realization hit me with a slow, creeping dread. You're saying she's still here? A nod. She never left. The knocking moved, traveling down the hallway, stopping at Grandma's bedroom door. I could hear breathing now, uneven, waiting. I don't have much time, Grandma said, her voice thinning. Stories demand witnesses. That's why you're here. What do I do? I asked, tears burning my eyes. You listen, she said gently, and when I'm gone, you tell it, out loud. Her figure faded, with the candlelight glow of the moon slipping behind clouds. The room warmed again, but the feeling remained, settled deep, permanent. In the distance, Grandma's door opened. I knew then this wasn't the end of the story. It was the part where the whisper chose a new voice. The next morning, the house felt alive in a different way. The creaks and sighs weren't ominous anymore. They were reminders, echoes of truths that had finally been spoken. Grandma sat at the kitchen table, a faint smile on her lips, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. I watched her, realizing how much weight had lifted from her shoulders in just one night. You heard it all, she said softly, without looking up. I did, I replied. My voice felt small in the space between us, heavy with awe and fear. She nodded. Some stories are meant to be heard, even if they're buried for decades. I whispered because I had no choice, but now you have one. I followed her every movement, noting the care she put into even small tasks. Each action seemed deliberate, measured, like she was reclaiming not just her story, but herself. Folding napkins, pouring tea, brushing crumbs from the table. Rituals that had once been meaningless now carried weight. That night, I waited again. Midnight came, but this time there were no whispers, no taps, no strange shadows. The house was silent, yet I felt a hum of expectation, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. I sat on the floor, leaning against the bedpost, eyes fixed on Grandma. She rose quietly, moving to the living room, the candlelight catching her gray hair and casting long shadows across the floor. She held an old envelope, yellowed and fragile, with handwriting I couldn't yet decipher. She set it on the table and turned to me. This, she whispered, is everything I kept hidden. Years of letters, promises, and memories no one else thought mattered. You must see them, so you understand why some secrets are dangerous to hide, but necessary to remember. I knelt beside her, hesitating before touching the envelope. It felt heavier than it should, burdened with decades of silence. She nodded, encouraging me to open it. Inside were letters, photographs, and legal documents, all pointing to someone we had never known. A girl taken from the family in secrecy, her existence erased. Eleanor, I read aloud, recognizing the name from the whispers. Grandma nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. She was real, and she was loved. Even when they told me to forget, I couldn't. I traced the edges of the letters with my fingers, absorbing the story that had haunted her for decades. Every line carried the weight of guilt, protection, and devotion. The whispers had been her way of preserving truth, and now it was mine to hold. Will you tell them? I asked softly. She shook her head. Not yet. Let the story live quietly for a while. But remember, silence is powerful, yes, but so is knowing when to speak. I realized then that the house was no longer haunted. The whispers had served their purpose. They had taught me patience, courage, and the weight of listening. And in that quiet understanding, I felt closer to her than ever before. That night, I stayed awake again. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to witness the final whispers. Grandma moved slowly to the living room, the candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths. I followed quietly, careful not to disturb the ritual she had established over the years. She sat in her chair, envelope open on her lap, fingers tracing lines of faded ink. "Some stories," she whispered, "live between the walls. They wait for ears willing to listen and hearts strong enough to carry them." I sat cross-legged on the floor, watching her closely. Every sigh, every pause in her speech felt deliberate. This wasn't mere storytelling, it was an act of remembrance, a preservation of what others had tried to erase. She lifted a photograph, worn and fragile. A girl, no older than 7, stood alone in a garden. Her eyes, bright and questioning, mirrored something I felt deep inside. "She was taken," Grandma said softly. "They said it was for the best. I said it was not." I leaned closer, feeling the intensity in her words. "Why whisper all these years?" I asked. "Because the world wasn't ready, and because sometimes silence is the only protection you can offer a child." The candle flickered, shadows dancing along the walls as if echoing her memories. I realized that the whispers weren't just a secret. They were a warning, a legacy, and a plea. "Eleanor was loved," she said again, almost to herself. "Loved enough to survive, even when the world tried to forget her." Hours passed like this. She whispered story after story, each one layered with fear, hope, and defiance. Names, dates, promises made and broken, deeds carried out in the shadows. Each fragment formed a mosaic of courage and sorrow. Finally, as the candle burned low, she leaned back and sighed, exhaustion heavy in her voice. "Now you know. Keep it safe, listen carefully, and remember why it matters." I nodded, overwhelmed, my hands shaking as I held the envelope. The weight of her life, her sacrifices, and her courage settled on my shoulders. I understood then that listening had been my first task, carrying the story would be my second. Grandma closed her eyes, the whisper finally ceasing, the room heavy with unspoken peace. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, gentle, like a lullaby for the long-forgotten. The house, too, seemed to breathe a little easier, relieved that the story had found a witness. The following days were quiet, but the air in the house had changed. Even when Grandma moved about her chores, there was a weight lifted from her posture, a lightness in her step I hadn't seen before. She hummed softly to herself, a tune that carried sadness and relief in equal measure. I watched her, noticing the lines on her face softened, as if sharing the secret had eased a decades-long burden. I spent most of my time beside her, reading letters, looking at photographs, and listening. Each page told a piece of the story, the family's decisions, the promises they had made, the lies they had told to protect themselves. I realized how carefully she had chosen what to reveal and what to leave unsaid. Every whisper, every secret, had been weighed against consequences we could barely imagine. At night, the whispers were fewer, but they returned in fragments, snippets of advice, memories, and reflections. "Trust your instincts," she whispered once, "and know that silence can protect, but truth sets free." Her voice was quieter now, more deliberate, and every word seemed designed to teach as much as to recall. One evening, she handed me a small key. "This opens the drawer where I kept her things," she said. My hand shook as I took it, realizing that what I was about to see represented decades of hidden love and loss. Inside were keepsakes, small trinkets, and notes, each one a testament to a life that had been erased from memory, but not from her heart. I spent hours examining them, piecing together the life of Eleanor, the girl Grandma had whispered about all these years. She had been hidden, protected, and forgotten by many, but remembered by one who loved her unconditionally. The weight of that love and the choices made to safeguard it settled in my chest with an almost physical presence. Grandma watched me, eyes glistening. "The world won't remember her unless you do," she whispered. "But remember also that memory is fragile. Handle it with care." I understood that this was the true gift of her whispers, not just the story itself, but the responsibility to honor it, to carry it forward, to let Eleanor's life be known, even if others had tried to erase it. The candlelight flickered against the walls, casting long shadows. Outside, the night was still, the house holding its breath. I felt that the whispers had completed their purpose, not to haunt, but to instruct, not to scare, but to teach. And for the first time, I understood the power of listening. That night, I finally understood the weight Grandma had carried for decades. She sat in her chair, candle flickering softly, the envelope of Eleanor's life on her lap. The shadows of the room stretched long and familiar, as if the house itself were leaning in to hear the final chapter. She looked at me, eyes steady and calm. "I've told you everything I could," she whispered. "Now it's yours to remember, to carry, to share when the time is right." I nodded, overwhelmed by the gravity of her words. Every whisper, every pause, every careful choice she had made in the darkness now felt like a lifeline stretching across time. She had protected someone who could not protect herself, and she had asked me to be her witness. I traced the edges of the photographs, noting the small details, the way Eleanor's hair fell across her forehead, the tilt of her smile, the innocence in her eyes that had never deserved to be hidden. I understood, with a sudden clarity, that the whispers were never about guilt alone. They were about love, about courage, about doing what was right, even when the world demanded otherwise. Grandma leaned back, sighing deeply, as if releasing a burden she had borne silently for too long. "The house remembers," she said, "and so should you. Memory is the only way we resist forgetting those who matter."